Okay, you guys, we have our quilt all basted and ready to go. We're in the home stretch, so we're gonna start quilting our quilt. Now, I think one of the easiest ways to quilt a quilt is to start by stitching in the ditch. So that's what we're going to be doing right now. So keep on watching. Okay, so when I say that we're going to stitch in the ditch, that means we're going to stitch down these seam lines. So right along here. Now, I have a presser foot that helps me do this very easily because it has this groove here that will help keep me in the ditch and guide the needle right there. So you don't need a presser foot like this, but it does make things a little easier, and I'll show you a little closer on the machine. Now, after we stitch the whole quilt in the ditch, I have these guide bars that attach to my quilt, and I have a link to them on my blog in the supplies post. Now these guide bars they're called a seam guide bar or a quilt guide bar. What I'm going to do is measure to the center of the quilt, and I'm going to use this guide bar to quilt down the center of our blocks to add a little bit more detail. And of course, I'm going to show you as we go along so that you'll see a little bit better, but I have guide bars that go in both directions just in case I need that while I'm sewing. But again, you could always use a ruler and mark lines on your quilt with either disappearing ink or with chalk that will come off easily later if you don't have these bars. But they are a great price. I looked on Amazon. I have the link to them on my blog. So definitely grab those if you can. It'll make things a lot easier. So let's head to the sewing machine. So before I get started sewing, what I like to do is roll up one side of my quilt so that it can fit under the arm of my sewing machine a little easier. So roll it up like this and get to about the middle. And we're gonna sew down this ditch here the whole width of the quilt. I like to start at the middle and work out one direction and then the other, and then we're gonna do that. We're gonna turn the quilt and do it the long way, and then we're gonna go down the center of the blocks in both directions, okay? Okay, so we're gonna move our quilt to the sewing machine and get it set up here. As you can see, I'm gonna line up that groove on my presser foot with, I have a string here. Oh, there it came out. So I'm gonna line up that groove on this presser foot with the ditch. And as I get to pins, I will unhook those and pull those out and set them to the side. But like I said, this groove will help me stay in the ditch. Now, juggling your quilt is going to be one of the hardest things you do while you're quilting. There's a lot of bulk here. As you get to the middle, it'll be a little bit easier because it'll go across your table, but it can be the most difficult part. All right, so let's go along the ditch here. Okay, as you go, you may need to adjust your quilt some, pull some up. Okay, it's going to be a learning curve. Just try not to get frustrated with it. Okay, and I'm using white thread so that hopefully you can see it and see what I'm doing. I'm gonna pull this pin out since I'm getting close to it. Okay. I'm gonna go slow here because I can start feeling the weight of all this quilt in my lap pulling down, and I don't want the weight of the quilt to affect my stitches. So I go slow, and if I feel like it's getting too heavy, I'll adjust and make sure it's not pulling too much. Okay. And I'll show you that even I don't stay in the seam perfect. Now you can see some of the parts up here where I'm a little outside of it. And that's where having coordinating thread and things like that will really help your project, because that thread will blend in. But one of the nice parts about quilts too is seeing that detail. So you can make the choice oftentimes to just not let that bother you. All right, so one thing that I like to do, and it is a feature on my sewing machine, is I can press a button that drops the needle down if I need to really shift the quilt around because it's pulling too much, lift some up on the table if I'm at that point where I can do that. And then with the needle down, it's not gonna skip a stitch. Now, if your sewing machine doesn't have that feature, there is a hand crank on the side that you can use to lower your needle. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and finish sewing down this row, and then we'll go on to the next one to the right, and then we're gonna turn our entire quilt and sew in the other direction, okay? Okay, so I have 3 rows that I've stitched already, and I'm just going to keep on working through these until I get to the end, and then I'm going to flip it and work in the other direction going to the left on the quilt. Okay, so I have this side of the quilt all quilted, going in one direction. So what I'm going to do is flip everything around, and we're going to start at the middle again and work this way. So you're kind of going to be moving in a different direction, but you're still doing straight lines, so everything should be okay. Again, I'm going to fold up the quilt a little bit so it can fit under the arm of the sewing machine. And we're just going to work again going in rows. We're going to start with this one and work out just so we can smooth if we need to as we go. Okay, everything is looking really good. So let's get going. Okay, so we just got to an end of that row, so I'm going to pull my fabric back toward me, and we're going to find the next row. This one has a pin on it. I'm going to make sure my backing fabric is pulled out. The last thing you'd want to do is accidentally have it folded down and sew over it, because as we know, nobody likes ripping seams. So whenever we can avoid that, we want to. So I'm gonna line back up on the seam. I'm gonna drop my needle. I have a button to do it. You may need to use your hand crank. I'm gonna remove this pin, and we're gonna start sewing this seam. And we are more than halfway done with quilting in this direction, and then we are going to go in the other direction, the length of the quilt. And we're going to do the same thing, just stitch along the seam. And the nice thing is that there are less seams to do in that direction. So this is why it's always nice to start with the direction that has more, because you'll feel like you've accomplished way more going that way. All right, let's keep on sewing. Okay, so we've stitched along the seam or stitched in the ditch, going the width of the quilt. And so now we're going to turn it, and we are going to stitch the length of the quilt. Now, since you have sewn all of these lines, the length, or the width of the quilt, you don't really have to start in the middle of it and work out in either direction now, because these are going to hold everything together pretty well. You're not going to get a lot of stretching. However, I'm still going to start in the middle and work out just because it's habit for me. So we're going to head back to the sewing machine and stitch the length of the quilt down all of the seams in both directions. Okay, so now that we have our quilt quilted along the seams in both directions, so we have squares around all of our blocks, we could, if we wanted to, just stop here. You don't have to necessarily quilt anymore. But I want to add a little bit more character to this quilt, so I'm going to quilt across the middle of the blocks, going in both directions, kind of creating an X or 4 mini shaped blocks in each square. So I have a tool for my sewing machine. It looks like this. You can get them off Amazon, and I'll make sure to post a link. But it helps me line up and make perfectly straight lines. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to attach this to your presser foot, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so right back here on the foot, on your presser foot, is a little screw and a hole. And so this is where your bar is going to slide in, and then once you get the distance between where your needle is and the bar, you can tighten that screw so that it doesn't move around. So how do we know what distance we want the bar to be? Well, let's take a look. Okay, so we have our squares on our quilt, and I want the thread in the needle to completely dissect this square. So our quilt square is 4.5 inches finished. So I'm gonna want my needle to be lined up at 2¼ inches. So what I'm going to do is that bar is going to run along the edge of my seams, and if I measure between the bar and where the needle is to 2¼ inches. Okay, so what I'm going to do, what we're going to do is try to get the middle of my presser foot, because that's where my needle is going to be, lined up at the 2¼ inches mark, which is right there. So 2¼ okay, and that bar is lined up right at the edge of the acrylic ruler. So if I tighten that, I need it to go just a tad. If I tighten that there, then the line that I sew down, as long as I keep this bar right at the seam, should be right in the middle of the square. Okay? So let's go ahead and start sewing and see how this works out. Okay, so the hardest part here is honestly remembering to watch the bar and not where your needle is, because I'm so used to watching the side of my presser foot or the center red line on my presser foot that remembering that I need to be watching over here is sometimes the hardest part. So you're just gonna have to train yourself and remember, okay, I need to watch the bar and make sure I stay at my seam. And then of course, always picking up and moving the quilt around is another part to remember. And I think I have some thread back here. Sometimes your threads will get caught. So if you feel it pulling, that might be why. Okay, we're good. Got it out. All right, so let's sew along here. Okay, so we finished our first row down the center, and you can see how straight it is. That seam bar really works beautifully. So we're going to keep working across our quilt just as we did before, and we're going to move on to the next row of blocks and sew down the center there, and we would just line up again at our seam, line the seam bar up at the next seam over. So we're going to keep working the width of the quilt, and then again we'll turn it lengthwise and we'll sew this direction. Okay, so yes, it does take time quilting, but I really think, and I think you'll see that if adding these extra lines in is really going to add some nice detail to your quilt, especially if you used a fun thread color, a nice contrasting thread color. It's really, you can really add a lot of fun to your quilt this way. Okay, so we're going to keep on sewing. Okay, so look at all these beautiful straight lines, the width of the quilt. It's all finished going in this direction, so we're going to turn the quilts and sew vertical. Okay, so see here, we are still going to line up this seam bar along our seam, and then that is going to allow the center of our presser foot to come down the center of the block and complete our quilting of our quilt we are so close to being done. I'm so excited to see it all finished. Okay, let's get to sewing. Wow, check this out. So we quilted our entire quilt. So we are in the home stretch. We're almost done with our quilt. The next part of this quilting series, we're going to be binding the quilt. And I used to find that to be the most terrifying part of quilting. My binding never laid flat or even. It often pulled or twisted. But I have a really good method for binding quilts now, and I'll be sharing that with you in the next part of this series. So if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, go ahead and subscribe now so you'll be notified when the binding video is ready to go. Thanks for watching, you guys. Bye.